Morning. So I read several chapters yesterday, but they didn't upload to YouTube, so I'm going to read them again today, and then I'll do a couple more posts so we can catch up to where we should be, because I've now read the next few chapters and they're rather good. So we're on chapter 17 of part 3. Lunch was lamb, vegetables, creamy mashed potatoes, and a wobbly pink blancmange with cherries on top for afters. While we were eating the lamb, Bertie made a joke about murderers, and Chapman dropped his serving platter and had to be helped by Hetty. Uncle Felix and Miss Alston shared yet more suspicious glances, and I thought again how very odd this weekend was turning out to be. "All right," said Daisy, half an hour later. The 4 of us were squashed into the crook of the big oak that stands just outside the walled garden, looking over onto fruit trees that had all of their early blooms shaken off by the storm. A few rotting boards had been knocked together to make a platform and a sort of roof, but they were green-smelling and slimy, and my seat was not at all comfortable. Every time I moved, I got more black stains across my knees and arms. The sky was grey and suspiciously damp-looking, but the rain was holding off for the moment. "Order, order! This meeting of the Detective Society is hereby convened. Beanie, stop wriggling. Bother you." "Sorry, Daisy," said Beanie. "I'll stop." "This place is fearfully uncomfortable, Daisy," said Kitty. "Really, do we have to be here?" "Yes. From up here we can see anyone coming. Do you want the murderer to creep up on us unawares?" "I don't like all this murder," said Beanie unhappily. "I wish there hadn't been one." "Well, whether you like it or not, there has been," said Daisy, "and now it's up to us to work out who it was." "I know," said Beanie. "I just don't like it." Daisy rolled her eyes at Kitty, who smirked back. I thought this was rather cruel. After all, there was a bit of me that understood what Beanie meant. I love detecting, but I also love being safe. Daisy has a short memory for bad things. All she can remember from the Deepdean murder is the glory, none of the horrible nighttime chasing. Sometimes I can't get the chasing out of my head. "All right," she said now. "We must consider the new information we have gathered since our last meeting. What evidence do we have? The missing cup and the watch, the scrap of paper from the book, and the forged documents. The missing cup and watch, now we've been over the cup before, but I do wonder more and more why the watch was taken as well." "Because it was pretty invaluable?" asked Beanie. "It's possible," said Daisy, "and if it was that, the most likely suspect would be Aunt Saskia. We must check her room to see if the watch is hidden there." "But there's someone else who's got a better motive to take the watch, Stephen." I squashed my lips together, but all the same I couldn't prevent a small noise coming out. Daisy rolled her eyes. "Hazel doesn't think he did it, of course, but even Hazel can be wrong. Now, Hetty and Mrs. D confirmed what we already knew, that Stephen is poor. The watch is quite obviously dreadfully valuable. What if he stole it to pay debts or something like that?" "But how would we check?" I asked. "Quite easily," said Daisy. "We use you. Go up to Stephen the very next chance you get and find out if he needs money. He likes you after all. He'll be honest." I wouldn't do it, I thought. I would not even for Daisy. But then I remembered who the other suspects were. If Daisy was willing to suspect her family, then I must be brave enough to rule out her brother's friend. I picked at the mould on the board next to me. Under my fingernails it turned quite black and foul. "Oh, all right," I said at last. "I'll ask him." "Excellent," said Daisy. "Look, the watch may be a blind. The murderer may just have taken it on a whim or by mistake. We must consider the other evidence too. Like that bit of paper you found on the dining room table. It was torn out of a book of poetry, and judging by that smudge on it, it's likely that the murderer used it to keep the poison in until they poured it into Mr. Curtis's tea. Unfortunately, this is less helpful than it seems. Mummy and Daddy aren't very bookish, but they could still have gone into the library and torn out a page. Oh, excuse me. And torn out a page, and any of the others might have had a book on them at the crucial moment." "But isn't it more likely to be someone who does read?" I asked. "Like Uncle Felix?" Daisy frowned. "I suppose so, yes. And even I have to admit Uncle Felix has been behaving in a thoroughly un-uncle-like manner. He's still lying about what he thinks happened to Mr. Curtis and doing everything he can to stop Mummy calling the police." "And Daisy," I said, "I think he might know Miss Alston. The way that they looked at each other just now, I really don't think they've only just met. Before you have to base that on his looks, Daisy began, but then Kitty cut in. Oh yes, I thought so too, she said. They looked awfully friendly when we saw them before lunch, didn't they? Daisy narrowed her eyes at both of us. She was outnumbered, and she wasn't used to it. She said, perhaps. We must watch Uncle Felix. I admit that, although I don't think it can be him. Even if he's been behaving oddly, we know he's good, just the way we knew Mr. Curtis was bad. I frowned. I wasn't sure that we did know that. I do think that it's less likely to be Mummy. If I was a bad detective who only went on feelings, not that this applies to anyone here, she glared at us, I'd rule her out because she's simply too upset about Mr. Curtis dying, and because she contacted the police when no one else wanted to. But of course we must be entirely rigorous. We need evidence of her innocence, and we don't have that yet. Perhaps if we conducted a recreation of the crime scene, we might be able to rule her or another suspect out. Yes, let's put that down on our to-do list. Now, the forged documents. These are terribly important bits of evidence, as they confirm that Miss Alston is not who she seems to be. She is at Fallingford under some sort of assumed identity. But why? Hazel and I witnessed Mr. Curtis threatening her outside the maze on Saturday morning. He seemed to know who she was. Did she kill him to prevent him telling Mummy and Daddy her secret? We must discover her true identity, and after what Mrs. D said, our best chance must be get hold of that handbag of hers and see what she's got hidden in there. She stared around at us, eyes wide, and we all nodded. Now, before we end, is there any new bit of evidence we've missed? I said, should we be watching Chapman? He's behaving awfully oddly. What if he knows something? Oh, said Beanie, you mean him dropping the tray at lunch today? Yes, I said, and lots of other things. That's an excellent thought, Hazel, said Daisy. Why, he might be protecting someone like... But then she paused. We both realised then who Chapman would be most likely to shield. Someone from Daisy's family. And not just that, but someone who was part of Fallingford itself. That meant Lady Hastings, Bertie, or Lord Hastings. Lord Hastings, I thought, who we had all seen shouting at Mr. Curtis on the morning of the murder. Who? Asked Beanie, wide-eyed. Who do you mean? Daisy and I looked at each other, and thankfully at that moment it began to rain. At first it was only a soft stumble on the leaves high above us, but then it gathered to a sigh, a swish, and finally a roar. Inside! Cried Daisy, as Kitty held up her hands to cover her hair. She is fearfully vain sometimes, and Daisy knows that. We were saved. We scrambled down the tree trunk, slipping and sliding, and getting our hands all smeared with horrid black mould. This meeting is adjourned, shrieked Daisy. Now, to move on to the next part of our investigation, ruling out suspects. Oh, I do like this bit. We pelted across the lawn, my hair draggled about my face, and the rain blurred everything in front of me like mist. As we dashed through the lashes of rain towards the front door, I wondered again whether we really wanted to know what had happened to Mr. Curtis. After all, he was a very nasty person. Whoever had killed him was far nicer than he could ever be, and they might be someone very important to Daisy. I felt guilty for thinking it, but how could Mr. Curtis's murderer deserve to be hanged? Part 4. Things begin to look rather black. Chapter 1. We came stumbling into the hall, shrieking and spilling water onto the stone floor. Daisy shaking her golden head like a dog, just in time to see something extremely curious. Miss Alston was standing at the foot of the main stairs speaking to Stephen. She was leaning forward in quite an intense manner, her eyes fixed on him, and although she kept her voice down, I managed to catch the phrase, "If you saw anything." Stephen looked terrified. His face was white and his freckles stood out, livid. I was alarmed. What had we overheard? I glanced at Daisy, eyes wide, to see what she made of it. This certainly was even more suspicious behaviour from Miss Alston. It sounded to me as though she was threatening Stephen. Why? Did she think he had seen something crucial to the mystery? Was she trying to make him reveal what he knew? Or did she want to make sure he kept silent? Miss Alston spun round and stared at us. Her brown handbag was, as always, clutched to her chest, and I wondered how on earth Daisy thought we would ever be able to get it away from her. "What's all this noise?" she asked. "Girls, what were you doing outside in the rain? You'll catch your deaths." Beanie shrieked. Kitty slapped her. I could not help gasping a little. After all the things we had been thinking about Miss Alston, this turn of phrase sounded most sinister. If she was the murderer, catching our deaths was exactly what she wanted us to do. The idea of sitting with her for a lesson made me feel utterly terrified. Miss Alston narrowed her eyes at us, and I tried to breathe normally. She said at last. I shall call Mrs. Doherty to come and help you get dried off. And then lessons, girls. Daisy, your mother doesn't want you sitting about moping. We're not moping, she said quickly. We're busy. Can't we have just a few more hours? I don't think I could bear a lesson now. Miss Alston puffed out her breath. Oh, very well, she said. 2 hours, but I want you in the music room at 5 o'clock precisely. Otherwise I shall come and find you. We all took a step backwards. Miss Alston frowned. Mrs. Doherty, she called, and Mrs. Doherty came running out of the kitchens. She gasped when she saw us. Good Lord, she cried. Hetty, towels, quick. We were wrapped up in piles of faded and slightly horsey-smelling towels. Whatever were you doing? Asked Mrs. Doherty, scrubbing away at Daisy's hair. Miss Alston waited to see that we were being attended to, and then she went up the stairs, handbag swinging from her arm as always. I was glad that she was gone, but where was she going? What was she going to do with the time until 5 o'clock? Stephen was turning away too. Stephen, I called as quietly as I could. Are you all right? I wanted to ask, was Miss Alston threatening you? But of course I couldn't. And so what came out sounded weak and strange. Oh, yes, said Stephen, coming towards me so that we could talk without the others hearing. Rather looking forward to going back to school, though, after all this. I nodded fervently. I couldn't even say how much I agreed with him. Funny, he went on smiling. I never thought I'd say that. Scholarship boy, you know. It can be rather hard when you're sharing a dorm with 2 lords and a viscount. If Bertie hadn't taken up with me, I'd have run away years ago. I didn't know you were on a scholarship, I said. My heart was hammering. What I was discovering was quite the opposite of what I had expected. What happens about university? Scholarship again, said Stephen. I only heard last month. I'm disgustingly lucky, really. He made a funny face, half ashamed, half happy. We aren't rich, not like here, but we get by, you know. I blushed. I didn't know. As well as the wedding cake compound, my father has a yacht and his own office building in the middle of Hong Kong, and we have 10 times more servants than Daisy's family. But it is easy to hide that under the skin of not being English. Yes, I said, hating myself a bit. Of course. I'm glad you're all right. Stephen smiled at me and then went hurrying up the stairs to find Bertie. I could hardly believe my luck. Stephen had a scholarship now and another for university next year. He didn't need money. There was no reason for him to steal the watch, and therefore no reason for him to kill Mr. Curtis. I was flooded with relief.